Welcome to the Johns Hopkins HEAT Corps Monthly Town Hall. We will begin our town hall with our dynamic panelists soon. Jennifer Ross is a highly accomplished education professional with more than 25 years of experience and expertise in the education sector. As Director for Education Initiatives, Ms. Ross oversees and coordinates Johns Hopkins initiatives aimed at improving the quality and access to education opportunities for children and youth in Baltimore City. Ms. Ross has made significant contributions to various institutions and organizations. Notably, she founded and served as Chief Executive Officer of the National Collegiate Preparatory Public Charter High School in Washington, D.C. In a previous role, Ms. Ross served as the Interim Executive Director of iMentor in the Baltimore region and played a pivotal role in the rebranding of the organization. And now, please welcome the moderator for tonight's Town Hall, Ms. Jennifer Ross.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jennifer Ross, the Director of Education Initiatives in Johns Hopkins Government, Community, and Economic Partnerships. And tonight I would like to welcome you to the Johns Hopkins HEAT Corps Community Town Hall. Tonight we are discussing gun violence, trauma, and its impact on our youth today. I'm lucky to have a wonderful panel of guests to help me with this very serious topic. They are all amazing experts in their fields, but for the sake of time, I will not be able to discuss their vast resumes, but I would like to introduce them. We are blessed and honored to have Keith Alexander, a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning crime and courts reporter for the Washington Post. We have Dr. Catherine Ling, who is Associate Professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. She has participated in the planning, implementation, and evaluation of macro and micro level health interventions for disease prevention and disaster planning. And we have Dr. Marcy Johnson, who specializes in neuropsychology and is trained in a range of evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapeutic approaches. So as you see, we have a very distinguished panel. We welcome you and thank you for your time. We're here because we're facing a pandemic of gun violence, and like COVID is pervasive. It is dangerous and it's affecting our youth at an alarming rate. According to thehill.com, in 2022, the cities with the highest gun homicide rate, Birmingham, Alabama, New Orleans, Louisiana, Jackson, Mississippi, and Baltimore, Maryland. So let's begin our discussion. That's pretty depressing kind of information. So I'd like to open it up and talk with our guests. I'll start with you, Keith. Thank you so much for being here. Can you briefly discuss what you've learned in your research about gun violence and youth?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Here in the nation's capital, here in Washington, D.C., last year in 2023, there were 274 homicides. That was the most in 20 years. Of those 274, 16 juveniles were killed, made up of those homicides. Overall, 102 juveniles were shot. And that's an average of about 9 a month. Those are pretty alarming statistics in a small city that Washington, D.C. really is. What we've seen here covering crime is multifaceted here. One of the things that we've seen is that a lot of young people are getting guns from adults, older people. Adults are supplying these young people with guns, a lot of them to get them to be involved in crimes, carjacking and thefts.
Mm-hmm.
They'll have a 22-year-old, 23-year-old will get a 14 or 15-year-old a gun, knowing that if the 14 or 15-year-old gets arrested, he or she will probably only do a couple of weeks or a couple of months in a juvenile detention center. So that's one of the main things that we're seeing. A lot of older people giving guns for young people. We're also seeing a lot of young people going online and using different words and different phrases to purchase guns. And a lot of times they are using guns to, again, commit crimes, but also as protection. A lot of young people are afraid in these cities, and they are carrying guns for protection, and they quickly use those guns. They think they're being threatened, and they will pull out the gun and shoot, sometimes getting the target, oftentimes not getting the target, getting someone else. So those are a lot of things that we are seeing, just in a quick nutshell, to explain what's happening here in the nation's capital.
Are you seeing, is there a difference or an increase in 2023 or 2022 post-COVID that we're seeing? Is there a difference?
A great question. COVID, from what we are seeing and what I'm hearing from parents, from probation officers, is that COVID had a dramatic effect on young people who were locked up in their homes for an entire year. And a lot of these homes are parents are not around. They had to fend for themselves. They were cut off from their friends. They were cut off from socialization. Mentally, emotionally, the effects of COVID, we are still hearing that in juvenile court. We are hearing from parents who are oftentimes mothers who are saying, my child is completely different than he was in 2020. I don't know my child anymore. My child does not want to come home anymore. He's always out in the street. 2020 has made them much more afraid of being at home. They would rather be out. So yes, the pandemic has had a very surprising effect. I don't think anyone really anticipated that we will see the lingering effects of the isolation and what that did to these young people for an entire year during that COVID time.
Absolutely. And not to pick on you, because we want to get to our other guests, but I did hear you on another show about a month ago, and you brought up something that I found to be scary and very enlightening. Someone had called in and said, well, why can't we find these guns? They have serial numbers, they can be traced and all of that. And you said what?
It's amazing that people think that these guns can be traced. These guns have serial numbers. That's 30 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. Today, these guns most of these guns do not have serial numbers. They're called ghost guns. Ghost guns are guns that are assembled. And the reason why they're so popular, they're ghosts, they're invisible. They're invisible because they don't have serial numbers. They can't be traced. Or many of these guns, the serial numbers have been sawed off or been engraved off. So a lot of these guns are not, the majority of these guns that these young people have are not traceable for that very reason. No serial numbers to be found. It's a new day.
Absolutely. And the thing is, we're talking about young people, their young bodies, their young minds. Their minds aren't fully developed. Their brains aren't fully developed. They aren't fully socialized, and they're doing very adult, reckless things. And so I kind of want to talk a little bit, move into the physical aspect of it with Catherine. The thing is that, I don't know, when I'm listening to the news, I hear something, a 14-year-old was shot, but they survived, they're in the hospital. And that makes me feel comforted, at least, oh, thank God they weren't killed. But there's so much more to that, isn't there?
There really is. That is an excellent point, because it's not just that 14-year-olds that survived. It might be their 9-year-old brother or sister, their 4-year-old niece or nephew, all of their neighbors, all of the kids in their classroom that look at that empty chair know what happened to that child. So you get second and third order effects of exposure to that level of violence. So when we hear about that 14-year-old, there's really an entire community that has been traumatized by that gunshot incident. And thank heavens they survived. Each child is precious, and their life is precious, and their potential is precious. And as we look at these adverse experiences around guns, we know that the trauma that these children are exposed to, their body will keep score, and it will accumulate. And the more they're exposed, the more trauma there is that accumulates, and the more it will hinder their physical and emotional development that results in behavioral and physical disease later on as adults.
Absolutely. And I did hear once a trauma surgeon that discussed the differences between, a small gun involved shooting as opposed to obviously a machine gun shooting. I'm thinking injuries. He was talking about the lead poisoning, the fact that more bullets have been in the body, the long-term effects of that.
And we know from that's absolutely, and we know from our service members who are injured that there's shrapnel, retained heavy metals that is associated with that. So it's not just that initial shooting and that initial trauma repair. It is the lifelong, ongoing impact that will have physically on the body, and also emotionally. That trauma just doesn't go away as the physical scars heal. There will be emotional scars that go with these children as well as they
Absolutely, which is a wonderful way to parlay to Marcy, to talk about what are the mental health aspects of the trauma that's incurred by that victim, and just as Catherine just said, the family altogether.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me with you all tonight. So as the other panelists have mentioned, there's extreme stress that's involved in these incidents, and people's responses to extremely stressful events or traumatic events vary across individuals. Some people are sort of able to organically move through those responses, while other people may get stuck in that intense reaction that they're having to a stressful event. And when people get stuck in that reaction, it falls under an umbrella that we call PTSD. So we have post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is something that absolutely individuals who are facing any type of life-threatening, either actual or perceived event can experience. And some of those symptoms include intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, memories of the event, avoiding things that might remind them of the event, negative mood, low mood, sort of a shift in their worldview, thinking everything is bad, things like that. And hyperarousal, so hypervigilance, being really alert about their surroundings and things like that. And this can happen to the person who experienced it, or like I said, people who witnessed it, or even further, we know in psychology, there's observational learning. So what that means is when you see something, you learn from that experience. And in a similar way, stress can sort of translate across individuals through seeing things or hearing about things.
So if you're a sibling and you see that your older sibling was shot and they're back, but they're traumatized, as a younger sibling, you may take that on, those feelings.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Keith mentioned the rising rate of violence in youth. Is there a correlation between chronic truancy and the rise in violent incidents? I'm going to throw that to you, Keith. Have you seen that?
All right. One of the things that I noticed, covering these juvenile cases is one of the prominent factors that is surprising to me, maybe it shouldn't be, is that a lot of these young people are truant. There's been a truancy issue. These kids are not in school for days and days and days. Again, post-COVID, we're seeing a lot of that. And unfortunately, there's no one at home to ensure or that these children are in school. And so when you see, but what's also interesting though is once these kids are in the juvenile system after committing a crime, and they are now taking classes, either at a shelter or what have you, or being forced to go to school, they're performing well in school. But for whatever reason, prior to their arrest, they were never in school. They weren't in school. And so that there is a link between truancy and for some reason, I guess city officials are grappling with, well, do you arrest young people for not going to school? Do you arrest the parents for not going to school? How to deal with chronic truancy? And I don't think anyone has really figured out a way to deal with chronic truancy. But the sad offset of that is that if you don't deal with chronic truancy, these kids are out in the streets, and eventually they're going to get caught up in something illegal. And so, but there is definitely a correlation between chronic truancy and violence with these kids.
And then to the point of what Marcy was saying earlier, if you've gone through such a situation and you're traumatized, you may be too afraid to go to school, too afraid to walk to school, too afraid to attend school. You know that there may be some dispute or some controversy that came around. So that in turn adds to the truancy.
It's one of the things that I've noticed in these cases that I've covered involving these young people who are charged with homicide is that they have had a loved one, either a classmate, a friend, a parent, an older sibling who has been killed by gun violence. And they were not able to deal with they never got counseling. They're still walking around grieving. That grieving translates, they're traumatized by that. And now they're being forced to go into having counseling and things of that nature, but they didn't get it previously. And their parents or people are saying there's a direct connection with losing a loved one, losing a friend to gun violence, and them just shutting down, completely shutting down emotionally, mentally, and just walking around like, okay, well, maybe the same thing's going to happen to me. It happened to my friend. I'm just going, but I'm going to carry this gun to make sure it doesn't happen. But if it does happen, that's just, that's the place we live in now. It's amazing the psychosis of what happens. And both, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Lee both said this, is that it's more than just a physical attribute. It's definitely an emotional, mental one that goes on, that lingers, and that affects other individuals.
And Marcy, are you seeing a different trend in mental health counseling as far as because of this upward trend for trauma? Are there changes in the way folks are being treated emotionally as far as the mental health care that they are receiving, or that we are trying, that the community is trying to give?
Yeah, I think that there are definitely efforts to address this, as Keith indicated, right? Like in the past, it may not have been as front and center, but I think there's still a lot of room to grow. I think that communities are still trying to figure out exactly how to address this issue. And in each community, it's going to look a little bit different. I think one of the big things that is going on is a movement toward advocacy around gun safety to try to prevent some of these occurrences from happening and taking a more proactive approach. But I think largely, this is in progress in a lot of ways. I'm not sure if Catherine might have something else to add on to that.
No, Marcy, I absolutely agree with you. And we have to start having these conversations out in the open. We don't have any qualms about asking a parent, do you put your child in a car seat? We ask adolescents, do you wear a seatbelt? Where are the questions around firearms? Is there a firearm in your home? Do you know where to get one? Is it locked up? Is it locked up and unloaded? Is the ammunition someplace else? What do you do when you feel angry? Who do you talk to when you feel sad? We don't need to assume that every young person walking in is fine. We need to assume that they have been exposed to some kind of adverse childhood experience and then gauge their safety. And we need to have these very frank conversations. We have a lot of adults that are afraid. We have a lot of adults who feel that they need to protect themselves and their property, and they have those firearms, but it doesn't mean that they know how to use them safely or how to store them safely. It is a horrible, horrible thing to have a young person who comes across this. They don't necessarily have an understanding of permanency, and they do something that has very permanent consequences.
Indeed. I'd like to broach the subject with the three of you about what role does social media play in gun violence and the actions. From what I'm hearing, that there are real trends with regard and correlations with social media?
Yeah, at least here in DC, I mean, that's one of the first places that homicide detectives go to. They go on social media, they look for clues because these young people, they go out there and they brag about what they did. They try to use coded language. They think adults won't understand what they're saying and bragging about a shooting. We're talking about retaliation on social media. How do I get a gun on social media? I mean, social media has become their way of talking, and also beefs, a lot of beefs, neighborhood beefs, beefs between groups happen over social media or start on social media and then continue out onto the streets. So social media has played a huge role in a lot of these homicides involving young people. And again, there's part of the reason why detectives go to social media accounts to see, okay, was this young person beefing with anybody? What's going on in that neighborhood, in that community? So yes, social media has become
The highway.
yes, the center, right? The rec center, if you will. Back in our day, there was a rec center where all the young people hung out, and you always find somebody or down at the playground. Unfortunately, down at the playground. Now they're not the playgrounds or rec centers. Now they're on social media and they're going back and forth, talking to each other and having beefs and what have you. So social media plays a huge role.
I'm sorry, Catherine, I don't know if there's something you want to add. I had a question.
No, go ask your question. I was just going to give Keith a big amen, especially because this is where kids are living their entire lives is on social media. Yes. That's, one of the things that the pandemic made incredibly clear is that young people have virtual lives. They may have best friends across the country that they've never seen or across the world. And they are living in these virtual spaces, and we ignore them at our peril and at their peril, quite frankly.
Absolutely, which is perfect. Because I wanted to know, are there interventions or possibilities, things that we could do to counteract on social media so that they're also seeing other kinds of messages? And I don't know if that's out there, if it's a possibility, or if there's conversations being had about such behavior.
Well, I'll be interested to hear from Marcy on this one. I know what I tell parents, and that's you need to be aware. If you want to know who your kids are hanging out with at school and afterwards, you also need to be aware of who they're hanging out with on their phone.
Absolutely.
I completely agree. So in April of 2023, the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, their health advisory on social media use in adolescence was published. And they gave sort of a lot of background research data on how social media is being used by adolescents, and then tips and strategies on how adults can intervene. And just like Catherine said, one of the main tips is sort of making social media a regular conversation in the household. So as a parent, having it not be something that's taboo or that your kid is doing in secret, but really normalizing social media to a degree while also setting parameters around what your child is engaged in, with the idea being that if it is a normal conversation, right? Like if it's normal to sit at the kitchen table and talk about like, oh, on Facebook today, I saw X, Y, and Z. If you allow your kid on Facebook, then you have a better chance of knowing what they're seeing and having that opportunity to intervene before things get out of hand. I think it's also just important to acknowledge, right, that social media is not unbiased, it's biased. What we see on our social media, the algorithms that are working below the surface, we're being funneled certain things. And so I think that plays a big role in this conversation. And I just wanted to mention it, in addition to the fact that we know that there is a correlation between seeing things online and increased symptoms of depression or PTSD, not necessarily a diagnosis of PTSD. I want to make that clear. You have to actually have witnessed or know have seen, had your physical life threatened or been in significant danger. So seeing something on the computer wouldn't necessarily have you meet criteria, but without splitting hairs, there's significant stress that kids are feeling by seeing these posts online.
Absolutely. I know that there are different initiatives that are put out there through families, communities, where they encourage people taking a fast from social media at certain times, just to give your brain and your thoughts a break. But I guess when we talk about where kids hang out besides social media, they're also at school. And so what do Marcy and Catherine, what would you offer school administrators and teachers who are going through this? Because I consider, if you work in a school that deals with children that have been traumatized, you work in a trauma school. And so how do you engage? How do you support? What kinds of things do you offer to administrators and teachers?
Well, I think it starts with, and I will own my own bias because I am a nurse, but I think every school needs a nurse. And I think every school needs to have a support system that is there on the everyday, not on the incident, but on the everyday, with your administrators as well as your instructional staff to sit there, because you can't pour from an empty cup. You can't address the trauma in the kids that are there, the families that are coming into your schools, if you are so empty and you're so traumatized yourself. So I think you have to have a trauma-informed structure to help deal with all of the pieces there. And also begin to look and really assess and address what are the specific needs of your kids. What are their physical and safety needs? Because if the school is known as a safe place, and I think Marcy and Keith very beautifully touched on this, if it's not safe, they don't go. And if their whole world is not safe, if they're being shot through the walls of their house, why would it be safe to go to school? Why would it be safe? I think of the kids in Chicago who they weren't safe on any of their routes into school. And so, you can't address truancy until you have a safe path to get there. And there are safe people in that building for you to talk to. So, we have to look and really begin to address those pieces, but also take into account the people we're asking to address that are having this secondary and tertiary effect as well. And we need to make sure that we're building strength areas and safe areas for them as well.
Absolutely. Marcy, do you know of opportunities for teachers and nurses and the school psychologists? Are they getting support in supporting these kids? And also, do you think that they should be the ones that start the dialogue at the school about gun prevention, gun violence prevention?
Yeah, no, I think those are all really great questions. And I think Catherine's points were really well stated. I think that it's an ongoing conversation and that it's something that people are trying to integrate into the systems. I know here in Baltimore, there's a trauma-informed care task force that Council Member Zeke Cohen is spearheading, trying to figure out how we can infuse trauma-informed care more into the school systems and hospital systems and other large institutions in our city. I think that, as Catherine mentioned, in a lot of ways, the nurses, the teachers, they are the frontline people. And so the responsibility will fall on them. They are the people that have the power to sort of cultivate a trusting environment. And it's a really hard job to do. And so they're going to need support, of course.
Absolutely.
So I think it's sort of, you know, when you zoom out, it really does take the whole community, from the council members to the school nurse or to the teacher in the classroom, to all kind of get on the same page and work together to figure out how we can get these trainings in place for the people who are on the ground, and how we can support their needs so that they can support the kids' needs.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Keith, you're in the courthouse all the time. You're, there hearing the dialogue, seeing what the sentences are, and do you see a trend? Do you see differences in as far as how long someone has to serve, or how people are feeling about I'm not trying to get into a political debate, but are there thoughts or discussions from policymakers that are saying there's something that we need to do?
Right. Here in DC, if a young person under the age of 18 is charged as a juvenile, then he or she, the maximum amount of time they could be ordered into a youth rehabilitation center, a detention center, is until their age 21, until their 21st birthday. And so oftentimes we have 15, 16, 17-year-olds who are charged as juveniles, and the maximum they can spend is until they're 21. Sometimes you'll see juveniles who are charged as adults, particularly when it comes to homicide. It's rare, but we're seeing more of it. It was interesting. Recently, I heard from the U.S. Attorney here in Washington, D.C., who said in the past, jurors did not feel comfortable having a teenager in front of them charged as an adult and facing decades in prison. But because we're seeing such an increase in violent crimes involving juveniles, that they are now getting a sense from community residents that, look, if these young people have committed violent crimes repeatedly as juveniles, then maybe they should be treated as an adult on their second or third offense, as opposed
So
to as
you're
continue
seeing it.
repeatedly.
You're seeing more an
Right.
increase, and you're
Right.
seeing it. Do you think you're seeing it more because it's affecting them on some level? You're afraid to go to your car. You don't know if someone's going to, hold you up with a gun. You're walking your dog innocently, and you're held up for your dog to be, taken. Do you think that has something to do with it?
Yeah, so that's exactly what was happening. Is that years ago, crime was often relegated to certain neighborhoods, certain communities in Washington, D.C. Well, not any longer. All across the district, they're seeing violent crimes, and violent crimes involving young people. So now, I think we're hearing from community residents is that enough is enough. That across the city, you are seeing residents who make up juror pools saying, what's
There's
going
no
on
safe
here?
place.
If they're doing adult crimes, then they should be treated as adults. And I think prosecutors are feeling more comfortable now charging juveniles as adults, and also to send messages to other juveniles that this is what would happen to you, not if, but when you are caught, if you commit a violent crime with a weapon.
And what are you seeing because I'm a former school administrator. Kids talk big in school. Oh, I'm not afraid of this. I'm okay. What are you seeing when you see them in the courtroom? Are they afraid? Are they traumatized? Are they concerned about their future?
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. I have yet to see a child. No, I've seen one child in the last year and a half cry in court, who's charged with a crime, a violent crime. A majority of these kids are very, at least in court, very strong, determined, not going to show any type of remorse. Yeah, I would say I have probably covered at least cases involving all of last year, maybe about 30 to 40 kids. And of those 30 to 40 kids, I've only seen one of those kids break down in tears.
Wow.
So these kids are very, at least, again, in an open courtroom, they give off a very strong sense of self, both male and female. unapologetic. A lot of them are saying that they were protecting themselves, at least if as long as there wasn't a robbery involved. A lot of these kids are saying that they were protecting themselves or they were being threatened, so they were within their right to protect themselves. But no, it's very little remorse.
Do you think that that has something to do with, Marcy, their state of trauma, that's PTSD? Do you think that there's a rise with these students in possibly, I don't know, passive personality disorders, so they don't feel it anymore, they've blocked off? What are you thinking when you hear something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be a whole host of different variables or different factors playing into it. I think that, there could be sort of that social component of I want to act tough for the way that my peers expect me to. I think developmentally that's very appropriate for adolescents to want to sort of act the way that they're expected to act or that they think their peers expect them to act. I also think that it could be habituation. So they're just used to this, and that it's they've seen it so many times and have been exposed to these types of situations so many times that it no longer has that same sort of impact that it may have had in the past. It could be that we're just not seeing it in that context, that maybe in private or with their parents or their trusted individuals, they are crying and they are broken up about it. I don't have the research offhand to support saying, there's a rise in personality disorders or anything like that. I think likely it's a combination of factors that's playing into what we're able to observe in a courthouse setting, for example.
Thank you. I think I would be remiss, we're talking about schools and violence, and really we were talking about individuals. I think it's also important to talk about mass shootings in schools, and the pervasiveness of that, and what brings that on, and what may Catherine or Marcy, where do you think that starts, and how do we go about trying to lessen that type of behavior?
All of these incidents are perpetuated with a firearm, and they're perpetuated by firearms these folks were able to get legally. And Keith, you were speaking a lot about crime, but a lot of the times these folks are able to go and buy firearms legally. And if we have to license,
I don't think young people are buying firearms legally. If they're in a mass shooting, a lot of these mass shootings, correct me if I'm wrong, are young people, are they not?
some of them, but like in Florida, you can be 18 and buy a firearm.
Well, and also I think kids may be getting guns from adults in their lives who have gotten them legally, potentially.
Right. And they are not necessarily licensed, and they are not locked and stored safely.
Absolutely. And we're seeing more of that having to occur. To a point that Keith made earlier about, do we discipline parents? We heard of the case in Virginia where a mother was sentenced because her child took a gun to school and shot the teacher. And so she was given a sentence for not keeping the gun safe, and it was easily accessible to the child to that point. Are there ways that we can lessen, besides the obvious of keeping a weapon away? Is there some personality or behavioral traits or patterns that we can see to help prevent such a crisis in a school, Marcy?
Yeah, well, I think, oftentimes, especially in the aftermath of these horrendous events, you hear, oh, there were signs, there were warnings of that the child or the person who committed the event or the shooting, there had been signs, there had been symptoms. And I think addressing those early signs is probably really critical. I think one thing that is important to mention in this conversation is oftentimes, or maybe not oftentimes, but I think that there is an aspect of this that suicidality is involved in. And I think that addressing suicidal ideation or looking out for warnings of a want to hurt yourself or to hurt somebody else is really critical in addressing this early on. We know that if you can get guns out of access or out of the way, that can reduce the risk of suicide. I think if you think about mass school shootings or school shootings as sort of committing suicide by, either shooting yourself at the end or having a police intervene, you can kind of put this in the context of mental illness, in specifically of suicidal intent.
Absolutely. When you talk about that, the teachers and nurses and parents are front line. I wonder if you all think that there's other ways to help our children. Do you think that there's an importance with mentorship? And how could that be used? Or have you seen kids who may have been in trouble before, how they evolved if they evolved from having a mentor? I'm going to throw that out to all of you.
We're seeing a lot of that with juveniles in these cases, hearing defense attorneys asking for mentors, specifically asking the judge to appoint a male mentor, specifically asking for a male mentor to work with my client. I'm hearing more of that. And I think, and it's so sad that a lot of these kids are growing up, a lot of these male youth are growing up without positive male role models. And for an attorney to see that and to ask a judge to make sure that he is has a mentor, and specifically these are young Black kids, a Black male mentor, that is really saying a lot, that these defense attorneys are saying that these kids need that. And so, we're seeing a lot of adults who spent time in juvenile detention centers coming back and working with young people to try to get them not to follow the same path that they went into. So we're seeing a lot of that here in the courthouse. There's these judges are working with crisis interrupters and people who spent time in prison and are now coming back and working with these young people to get them to realize there's another way of handling disputes, another way of dealing with trauma. So we're seeing a lot of that here in DC Superior Court.
Do you all see, besides mentorship, do you see or do you know of what is missing in the conversation about gun violence that we are not? I feel like there's something happening where we are not changing the minds of our youth. They are not affected by events. Like you said, they go to court and they act stoic. What is missing in the conversation, do you think, that we need to put in so that the children start to see, because they really are still children, that this is so serious and that a change needs to come? I'll start with you, Catherine, if you have any thoughts.
Well, we have to build community. I mean, it's very telling that as these children became more isolated, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we started seeing a rise in gun violence as well as in other conditions going on. So, creating community where we have very frank discussions about, you may be these are feelings. Feelings are neither good nor bad. You just have them. It's what you do with them. Let's talk about some ways that you can work with these feelings that you may not be seeing in other areas. Do we have mentors, like Keith was saying? Do we have folks coming in from the community that can show assistance in coping? Are we creating these safe spaces where these kids can come, where we can have these conversations, where we have them preemptively and not just around teaching kindergartners to hide behind their backpacks because somebody's going to break into their kindergarten
Absolutely.
classroom and shoot them. But this is what you do with your feelings, and this is how you talk about being upset with somebody and not liking the choices, and how you stand up for yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Marcy, are you seeing more recommendations or referrals coming to you after events, or you and your colleagues, I should say, to mental health professionals as a whole? Are you seeing that you're having to go into schools more often, or changing in practices because of this pandemic?
I think there's absolutely an increased need for it that we're seeing. I think the logistics of how to get people into these places is difficult, and especially difficult in our American healthcare system. And I think oftentimes there's absolutely an increased need increase in need of mental health care during the pandemic, since the pandemic, in sort of broadly speaking. I think that the resources available differ depending on what community you're a part of, and that can be a major challenge.
Absolutely. And that's, you went right into something I was going to ask you next, which is, how do we get more mental health support coming into all communities, so that we can take care of and see some of the triggers that Catherine was talking about? So there is more mentorship and all that. How do we get more mental health into support into all the communities?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question. And if I knew the 100% answer, that would be, I think, incredible for all of us.
We could solve it today.
We could solve it right here, right now. I think, though, that it takes thinking about multiple different factors. So I think that, we absolutely need the support of the political systems in our communities to help get providers into the school systems. And it also then circles back to what Catherine mentioned, right? Training those frontline workers who are already in the system to recognize signs and symptoms, giving them that additional layer of confidence that they can recognize, sort of, okay, this kid, I'm noticing what they're saying, or I'm noticing their behavior, and then they feel like they have the resources to take the next step, either themselves, or to say, okay, we need to try to find a provider for this person. Unfortunately, right, there is a huge lack of providers that take Medicaid and Medicare and some of the lower cost insurances, and it's really a problem to getting the help that certain
People need,
communities need,
and they can't afford it.
Absolutely.
And we have to find avenues for them, for everyone,
nonprofits, politicians, it's going to take a lot of creativity in the system that we're in.
In our last few moments together, I really would like to ask what, there is, we just, but there is no one way to do something to solve this problem. I think it takes many different ways, but I'd like to back it up first before we talk about that and see what differences have you seen. For example, Keith, you've been in this business for a very long time. I'm not calling you old. I'm just saying, that you have lots of experience. And so I want to know, do you see a difference as far as attitudes for this type of behavior? Has it become kind of like rote, like, oh, here's another shooting, here's another occurrence, as opposed to when we were shocked in the early 2000s, late 90s, when we hear about these shootings?
No, I think you're seeing more surprising reaction from people who are saying when it was involving juvenile and crime. We're seeing cases involving 11-year-olds carrying guns and involved in violent crime, 12-year-olds. And that is really, it's causing concern, it's causing anger in the community. And like I said before, federal prosecutors are noticing that people in the community are now tired of these young people. I mean, you have people driving through DC, and now they are nervous about their cars being carjacked, of all ages, of all parts of DC, and a lot of these carjackers are under the age of 18. And they either have a gun or they have a BB gun or they have their hand inside their waistband, acting like they have a gun, and stealing cars and using these cars to steal other cars. And so, yeah, you're seeing a lot of frustration, a lot of anger within the community, that and residents saying that politicians and law enforcement and prosecutors aren't doing enough. And one of the things that we haven't talked about, and that we really also should mention, is that the economics, that a lot of these families, these people are living in poverty. And a lot of these kids, particularly 13 and 14-year-olds, are having to fend for themselves or having to support their family. And so they are out here with guns, committing crimes and selling cars and selling things, pocketbooks that they've stolen, and selling things online to bring in money into their home. And that's something that's really needs also to be addressed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. More resources, more opportunity for them to not feel that they need to be the parentified child and go out there and forage for their family.
Exactly. And a lot of when you're seeing these kids who are carjacking, some of it is for thrill, but most of it is not for thrill. Most of these kids are carjacking, and they are going online and they are literally on social media selling these cars for $500 just so they can bring in money.
$1,500. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
just so they can bring in money for the house. And they're storing weapons to do that. And the parents claim that they don't know anything about it. Meanwhile, the parents aren't working themselves. And so there's a reason, the money is coming in somehow into the house. And it's surprising that sometimes parents don't know how these kids are getting these new Air Jordans and new flat screen TVs and things of that nature, because they're out there,
but they know,
committing crimes to support the house.
Question: do you see a difference in the health care trends, Catherine, within the medical field, with this pervasiveness? Meaning that before it was something nuanced, and now, again, there becomes this, that's just the way that it is.
Unfortunately, yes. You think back and when we first started researching ACEs, adverse childhood. We used to call them events, and now we call them, it's more of an experience, meaning longitudinal. Gun violence was not considered part of the original group of 9 or 10 ACEs that were put together. But we know through research that they really are. And so asking about guns in the home, access to guns, and all of those pieces are part of just a routine safety check. We have sometimes a real rash of headaches and tummy aches after there's been school shootings or a lot of the shooting drills. And so you have to really dig into context to find out what all's going on, to get to the core of what this child and what this family needs.
And do you see, for example, there was a mass shooting in Baltimore in July. still no one has been prosecuted for it or charged. And the community isn't really talking about it. And I see that there are times when other things are happening in schools that I may hear about from colleagues, or a gun showed up in a school, and you don't hear about it. Do you think that that's having a factor in that children are feeling like it's okay to do this now, that it's kind of accepted and it's no big deal?
Well, not only that's no big deal, I also think a lot of these young people are doing stuff so they can get that 15 minutes of fame on social media. They get bragging rights. They are now the subject of, and we've seen young people bragging, oh, that Fox 5 news story, that's about me. That shooting, I did that. And so we're seeing a lot of bragging rights of these young people. These young people are boasting
Getting
about
street
these violent
cred,
incidents, especially when it's covered by the media.
Really important point. Catherine, was there something? I'm sorry.
No. I think, Keith's wisdom and insight is really helpful there. It is a point of that credibility. It is a point of, well, what else am I going to do? I have to make it. I'm supposed to go there. I have to be safe. This is how I deal with things. This is how the people around me are dealing with things. And this is how I'm going to choose to deal with things.
So in our last few moments, I'd like to offer an opportunity for each one of you. Like I said, there's no one pill, there's no one way to lessen this. I think we have to work collectively. And I just would like to know from each one of you, what do you think is a way that we can lessen gun violence? What is the most salient point that as a community we need to think of to add to helping and lessening this pandemic? I'll start with you, Marcy.
Sure. I think that from my perspective as a mental health provider, with these extremely stressful events, one of the things that maintains the symptoms of post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression is avoidance. And when we avoid talking about these things and addressing these things head on, it just allows these things to grow and grow and grow and grow. And so I think setting up spaces where we are not only talking about gun violence like we are here, but also working together to, as a community, figure out actionable items. Behavior is largely learned, and it's important for the kids to learn from parents to learn from neighbors to learn from, their clergymen or whoever they look up to. Humans are social creatures that learn from one another. And I think figuring out how we can learn together to reduce gun violence could be a fruitful avenue.
Thank you. Catherine, what would be your one thing?
I think being really intentional about safe community, and it really follows in line with what Marcy was talking about, is creating safe spaces to acknowledge what's going on, learn about what's happening, really treat firearms as they should be treated, with safety protocols, and having those open conversations, as well as the feelings that are associated with direct and indirect trauma, and making sure that the safe people are getting their needs met as well. So creating that safe community feel and interweaving that creates that safety net, where we can catch not only the individual who may be tending towards violence, but also shore up those folks who are around them.
Thank you. Keith?
When I talk to DC police officers, one of the things they say that they're most surprised by with young people today is that, 20 years ago, 10, 20 years ago, a juvenile's first offense was often truancy or shoplifting. But now their first offense involves a weapon. And that's what's blowing the minds of long-term DC officers who've been in this city for 20, 30 years, that the first offense is now a violent one, and they have not seen that before. And I've heard this before, and I'm just gonna throw this out there, and I'm sure how parents will appreciate this. But there's a movement afoot. Some people are saying that if a juvenile is involved in more than 2 offenses that involve a weapon, but that second offense, the parents need to also be charged. The first time, okay, we'll trump it up to youth indiscretion. But a second time, then the parents need to be also somehow charged, because we're seeing these young people who are repeat offenders, and the crimes are escalating in violence. And so people are talking about, well, if these kids are becoming repeat offenders while still juveniles, then maybe we should be also bringing in their parents and charging their parents as well. So I'll just throw that out there and let that be a dinner conversation for people who are watching.
Okay. Well, I thank you for that. And I thank you all, because I think what's important to me, I'll say, is that we keep the conversation going and we have different conversations with different people and come together and talk about it. Because if we don't keep the conversation going, we're going to have more of a problem. And so I'd like to thank you all for being my guests tonight. It was a wonderful conversation, something that we need to take seriously and have again. So thank you, Dr. Catherine Ling. Thank you, Dr. Marcy Johnson. And thank you, Mr. Keith Alexander, for your time. Have a good one.